the United States has 3 meanings. And one meaning would be just like all of, say you were abroad, you were over in Europe, and you're saying, well, I'm a citizen of the United States of America, as one conglomeration, which would include everything, Washington, D.C., everything. The second meaning would be the 50 sovereign states. And the third meaning, and the one that's got us into all this trouble, is just those territories and possessions belonging to the United States. There is one definition of the United States that only includes Washington, D.C. here on this continent, other than places which we specifically say in a state there was a military base, like the Los Alamitos military base in California. That particular base would be ceded over to the federal government, and it would come under federal jurisdiction, and it would not have constitutional protection. That's why you see a lot in the military, you see a lot of times rights that are just being stomped on because they don't have to adhere to those particular rights. And it's important to understand this because then, once you realize that there's this other class of citizens, then when you see a law applicable to the United States citizen subject to its jurisdiction, when you understand the jurisdictional issue and you understand that we the people are the absolute sovereigns, so we're not under the United States jurisdiction. They actually created a corporation and they called it the United States with a capital U. Whereas if you look at the Declaration of Independence, you see United has a small u. It's just an adjective and it's modifying states. It isn't a proper noun. But the other United States, that is just the territories of the United States. So now when you understand that Congress legislates for 2 different United States, you better ask yourself, which United States are they talking about? And there's actually a premise of law that says all legislation is territorial unless a counter intent is evident. That's because the sovereign citizens of the 50 states are basically self-governing, and the only legislation created for them was that legislation specifically delegated to it in the Constitution. They would actually provide that the Congress could actually create legislation. And they did that very quickly. So the majority, 99% of what comes out of the government is actually federal legislation. So if it actually includes the 50 states, it has to specifically state in the definition of the United States that it includes the 50 states. And when you're dealing with federal legislation, when it says 50 states, it has to use the small s. You see, because the corporate United States, through its charter powers, created corporate states. The state of California is actually a different entity altogether than the California Republic. Just as if you were to get a corporation, your corporation is a separate entity from you as an individual. And so you have the state of California, and in federal legislation, when you see that capital S, they're talking about that corporate state. That's where the California Franchise Tax Board comes in. It's just the same harlot in a different gown. It's just a creature of the United States corporation, and then you have the state corporation, and then it creates municipal corporations. And we also know how our rights are violated on a municipal level. We have a constitutional right to travel freely, but how many of us have gotten tickets for trying to exert that constitutional right? And by utilizing these corporate structures, they've been able to penetrate our rights. And there is no such thing as a citizen of the state of California because it's just a corporate body. You can't be a citizen of a corporation. You can't be a citizen of a contract. You can only be a citizen of a sovereign state. So you are citizens of the California Republic. The state of California can only have franchisees, and that's where the Franchise Tax Board comes in. It just legislates for its franchisees, and it creates legislation for corporations. And it's important to know who we are so we stop letting the government infringe upon our rights. And if enough of us know our rights and enough of us stand up and say we're not going to take anymore, the government is going to have to start listening to us. Now back to the citizen subject to its jurisdiction. This is very important as far as the Internal Revenue Code goes. Because specifically, if you look at the individual income tax, it's imposed in Subtitle A, Section 1. For years, the Patriots have said, where's the tax? Where's the tax? Well, there it was, Subtitle A, Section 1, but the important question is where is the tax that's imposed upon the citizens of the 50 states? Because it turns out that this isn't our tax, because when you go to the regulations, that interpret the code. There's 2 volumes of the Internal Revenue Code, and then there's 4 volumes of regulations which interpret each section. There's almost 10,000 sections in the code, and then there's equivalent sections in the regulations explaining them. And section 1.1-1C says something very interesting. It says that the graduated income tax is imposed upon the citizen, and you think, well, how can that be? It's an unconstitutional tax. And then you go down to C, and you see citizen defined, and you see why it is constitutional, because it isn't us. It is that citizen subject to its jurisdiction upon which the United States can create legislation without constitutional restrictions. It is not the sovereign citizens of the 50 states. And we got into this mess back in 1942, which was when we had the victory tax, and people were very patriotic at the time, and there was a war going on, and they imposed a flat 5% tax. And probably today, under the same circumstances, many of us might volunteer if we felt strong enough about the cause. And though they utilized the part of the Constitution that said that the government could appropriate funds in the time of war, but no such appropriation could last longer than 2 years. And right in the act, it specifically said that this act would rescind itself at the end of the hostilities. And sure enough, in 1944, you go and you look at our law book, and you see that indeed it did, that the Victory Tax Act was rescinded. And that time, the income tax became voluntary. In fact, the Supreme Court, in a decision that has never been overturned, no matter how the IRS tries to skate around this. Now, again, there are some entities over which the tax is mandatory. If you're a federal government employee, or if you're a citizen subject to its jurisdiction. So they might say, oh no, it's not voluntary, but they take everything out of context. It's not voluntary for some citizens, but I'll tell you what, if you are a citizen, and if you were born in one of the sovereign 50 states, and if you are exercising your constitutional right to labor in a lawful, unregulated occupation, that income tax is, for a fact, voluntary for you, and the Supreme Court stated so in Flora versus U.S., 362 U.S. 145. Our tax system is based upon voluntary assessment and payment, and not upon distraint. In fact, this is a summary of my conclusions on the income tax system. It's kind of a summary of the whole book, and I'm going to go over it real quickly with you. It says, the Constitution recognizes 2 classes of direct and indirect taxes, and lays down 2 rules by which their imposition must be governed, namely the rule of apportionment as to direct taxes, and that means divide equally, and the rule of uniformity as to duties, imposts, and excises. Wouldn't we think it was ridiculous if we went to buy a car, 2 of us, and they told one of us, well, you're going to have to pay more tax because you earn more money on the same car. And that's basically what they're doing to us with the graduated tax. We are being penalized for having more education, for working more hours, for having a harder profession. That's not what our founding fathers had in mind for us. In fact, they only wanted direct taxes imposed in times of war. Direct taxes bear immediately upon persons, upon possessions, and upon enjoyment of rights. So that's your property. Your rights are actually your property. Indirect taxes are levied upon a happening of an event. And direct taxes, the Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 states, direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4 says that no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid in unless in proportion to the census of enumeration. That means they were going to delegate a fair share to each particular state, and then the state would in turn delegate responsibility based upon the number of citizens that it had. In 1895, direct unapportioned taxes were ruled to be unconstitutional. This decision was Pollock versus Farmers and Loan and Trust Company, 157 U.S. 420. And they stated, we are of the opinion that taxes on personal property, being a direct tax, the income of personal property are likewise direct taxes. The tax so far as it falls on the income of real estate or personal property being a direct tax within the meaning of the Constitution, and therefore unconstitutional and void, because not apportioned according to representation. In the Congressional Record of June 16, 1909, they're talking about the potential enactment of the 16th Amendment and about the corporate tax, and this is President Taft speaking, and he says, "It is now proposed to make up the deficit by the imposition of a general income tax in the form, substance, and almost the same character as that which in the case of Pollock versus Farmer Loan and Trust Association was held to be a direct tax and therefore not within the power of the federal government to impose unless apportioned among the several states according to the population." That's really important, he said. Again, I want to read it to you. It says, "was held to be a direct tax and therefore not within the power of the federal government to impose unless apportioned among the several states according to the population. I therefore recommend an amendment imposing upon all corporations an excise tax measured by 2% on the net income of all such corporations. This is an excise on the privilege of doing business as an artificial entity." That's one of the maxims of law. You cannot impose a tax on the exercise of a right. You can only impose a tax on the exercise of a privilege, and that's because of the part of the Constitution that says that the government can take nothing from us without giving us just compensation. So if there's a privilege exercise, there is some form of just compensation. Say, for example, we were to get a Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise and we agreed to pay a 5% royalty. We get something in return. We get their name and their recipes and something of value. We would make more money than we normally would have, and that's kind of like a privilege. And then he specifically states, this course is much to be preferred to the one proposal of reenacting the law once judicially declared to be unconstitutional. So President Taft admitted that the Pollock decision found that the direct tax was to be unconstitutional. Now, when you have a Supreme Court decision, the only way you can get it overturned is through a constitutional amendment. So that was the purpose of the 16th Amendment, was to create an amendment so that they could do away with these apportionment clauses that our founding fathers put there to bind our government by its chains. They wanted to get rid of them, so they were going to come up with the 16th Amendment. But they weren't very bright about the way they put it together, and the congressmen were a little bit smarter than they anticipated. 3 times they tried to have it enacted with the word direct in it, and 3 times the Congress refused to accept it with the word direct in it. So they kept rewriting it, and finally they came up with the 16th Amendment that we have today. But here's what the Supreme Court in 1916, so this was in 1913. 3 years later, this issue again comes before the Supreme Court. And this is what they said. They said, the 16th Amendment contains nothing repudiating or challenging the rule of the Pollock case. So did they achieve their effort? No, they did not. The 16th Amendment actually has absolutely no meaning except to mislead us and to defraud us. In 1916 again, in the Bruchever case, they stated, now this was Bruchever again, he was challenging the constitutionality of the 16th Amendment. And basically the conclusion that they came to here was, his confusion arises from his erroneous conclusion that the 16th Amendment provides a power to levy an income tax, although direct, should not be subject to the regulation of apportionment. The far-reaching effect of this erroneous assumption, if acceded to, would cause one provision of the Constitution to destroy another, bringing the amendment into irreconcilable conflict with the general requirement that all directs be apportioned, all direct taxes be apportioned. You see, nowhere in there do they repeal the apportionment clauses of the Constitution. And what the Bruchever court said was, well, this is specifically for those types of taxes that aren't subject to the rules of apportionment. Therefore, they must be only applicable to indirect taxes, because everybody knows that direct taxes have to be apportioned. The result would create radical and destructive changes to our constitutional system. Now, this is really important because the government used to get the citizens with this one. They'd say, that 16th Amendment is unconstitutional. And they'd come back and say, no, the Bruchever case said that it was constitutional. And for a fact, it is.